Okay, so let's begin. It's like 7:01, so let's start. So, I knew there was something I needed to get.
Not only do we like you here, we like you at future events too.
And that's what we're going to talk about first. So, as you know, we have, okay, so good evening. Thank you all for coming. My name is Annette Benbow, and I am chair of the events committee at the Arlington Historical Society. So, Cathy is right. We're happy that you're here. We're happy that you're online with us. And before we get started, I want to highlight a couple things. As you know, if you know us, we do an event every single month on the second Thursday of the month. Okay, so here it is today. That's a good sign. I wanted to tell you what the next month is going to be. The next month is going to be all about the Rambler. Anybody remember the Rambler? I would be surprised. You do? And there's another one. Okay, excellent. So the Rambler was an early photojournalist, and he worked for Washington Star. So Marty Sugar is going to be talking to us about the many historic stories that he recorded in the newspaper that allow us to know a lot more about history about 100 years ago. So that is next second Thursday on April 11th. But before all that, one of the other things I do for the Arlington Historical Society is that I run the Ball Sellers House. Who knows about the Ball Sellers House? Oh, I love all those hands. That's so fabulous. That makes me feel much better. Yeah, Jerry, you would because you're a docent. Thank you. Excellent. I'm always happy to have more docents. So on April 6th, that's a Saturday, it's our opening day. And we like to do something big and exciting on opening day. So at 1 o'clock, we will be opening like normal every Saturday from April through October. But this particular Saturday, we will be having the Monumental City Ancient Fife and Drum Corps, and they will be performing colonial era songs. They'll do their thing for about an hour. They'll talk with kids. They'll show kids the instruments. So they're really lovely. And following them, we're going to have members of the Guillotine Theater out of Georgetown, and they will also be singing colonial songs. So there'll be, a little bit of this and then a little bit of that. And during that period, we'll have lots of reenactors who you will be able to experience the sounds and sights of a farmhouse in the 1750s. So that's April 6th. It's a Saturday and it's 1 to 4. So I look forward to seeing you all there. Oh yeah, and there's free food. Okay, so enough said. I'll get on to why we're really here. Okay, so tonight, we're going to be hearing about women who fought for our community in very different ways and in separate ways. It is, of course, Women's History Month, so we thought it would be perfect to have Cathy Hix, Cathy Bonneville Hix, speak to us about several women who have made a difference in our community. So Cathy retired in 2019 after serving for 39 years as an educator at Arlington's public schools. That in itself deserves applause. First, she was a social studies teacher, then she was a social studies specialist, and finally, she retired as the K through 12 supervisor of social studies. How perfect is that for her to be a member of the board of directors of the Arlington Historical Society? Cathy's done extensive work in curriculum development and has worked as an educational consultant for the Virginia Department of Education. She is an Arlington native, and she was raised and educated in the county. She's been on the board of directors since 2016, and she served as president for 5 of those years. During her tenure as president, Cathy frequently spoke to the community about Arlington's history and the need to preserve and share our diverse history with all. She was asked to represent AHS in the community, but and several venues, including serving on Arlington County's World War I Commemorative Task Force and the Centennial of Arlington's Naming Committee. So without further ado, thank you for doing this, Cathy. Yep.
Good evening. I think it's really great. I'm really excited to talk about women in Arlington and in Women's History Month. And I appreciate you all coming out. So I'm going to start along the lines here. Let me make sure I got the right clicker going the right direction. So Arlington women have been fighting for the community throughout the history, even before we were Arlington and part of Alexandria. So I'm just going to highlight a few of these people throughout history. We're going to start with Selina Gray. She was enslaved at the Arlington House on the Custis Estate. And she was there at the time that Robert E. Lee and his wife, who was Custis's daughter, lived on the estate. And the Union troops were approaching. As you know, they eventually took over and moved into the estate. And when Mrs. Robert E. Lee left, she handed the keys to Selina Gray. And Selina Gray defiantly protected the artifacts of George Washington and Martha Washington, who were related. George Washington Custis was the stepson of George Washington. And so it's through her that we are able to have much of that family's legacy. So she's our first highlight. Here's another one, Gertrude Lynn Crocker. She came to this area as a suffragette. She was over town protesting, advocating for the women's right, served along many famous women's rights fighters. And she was actually arrested and jailed. She spent time in the Occoquan workhouse, which was one of the places that women were sent when they were arrested for protesting. And she eventually moved into Arlington and she ran a little tea house. And it was a very frequent visitation place for people from DC to come over. So here she is fighting for women's rights. The next is the League of Women Voters. And the 19th Amendment is passed in the late 1900s, and in 1920, Arlington women were able to vote. Certainly, we know that if you look at any history of women, women were not considered able to vote, even though women were very outspoken. But when giving the right, we had formed in this county the League of the League of Women Voters, still active today. And they were all about educating people on their rights to vote, and then also education, bipartisan education, nonpartisan education about who they might vote for and issues. I am especially appreciative of this group because when I was a supervisor of social studies, I worked with them closely because they would come into the schools every year and educate the high school students, many of them who were registering to vote for the first time. So they were fighting to make sure that we were understanding our voting rights in our community. The next one, and I apologize, I looked for a better picture, and unfortunately, this is the only one that I could find. Esther Cooper. She was the first president of the NAACP and one of the founding members. And I'm going to talk about her a little bit later because she was one of the early reformers for educational equality. Ellen Bosman, very well known. If you've gone to the Government Center, we know it's named after her. She had a very distinguished service in the county. She was a transplant to Arlington and got involved in community engagement. And she was recognized as one of the most dedicated public servants in Virginia history. She especially was focused on the affordable housing. Although I had the opportunity to talk with Carmela Hamm, one of the ladies I'm focusing on tonight, her daughter, and she said that Ellen Bosman was also a really strong supporter of the fight for equality and civil rights in Arlington. Emma Violán Sanchez, some of you might have seen her earlier this year. She came to from Bolivia, and she was an immigrant to Arlington, married a gentleman, an American that died in the Vietnam War. She served in a lot of roles. She was one of the first teachers to teach students that were coming here with a second language. She eventually was the supervisor of that particular group of people, like programs for our second language learners. She served on the school board. She was a very big fan of mine because she made sure I had money to do local history projects and focus on our local history. But one of her most significant achievements is she founded the Dream Project, and they provide scholarships and mentorships for undocumented immigrants in our county. So now we're going to move into my focus tonight, and that is women that fought to end desegregation of Arlington schools. And I wanted to let most of you probably know that Arlington was the first county in the state to desegregate, but only by 10 minutes. We just had an earlier starting time, but we were there, but it was definitely a struggle. And I want to tell you why this is an important story to me. Number one, because I was a student in Arlington Public Schools when a lot of this was going on. I had no idea. We didn't have social media. I went to an all-white school, never went to school with a person of color until 1971. And I was not aware of the struggle going on in the county. And so it's important to me that people are aware of the struggle. The second thing is, Annette has already mentioned, I had 39 years in Arlington Public Schools in a variety of roles. And one of the things I used to say to my students is, history happened right here. We read in the history book and we think that it happens elsewhere, but it happened right here. And this particular issue, the desegregation of schools, was a microcosm of what happened all over, or in many places throughout the country. And so I think it's really important. I think when you teach local history, it connects people to national history. And so I think it's important to tell the story. And then lastly, my father played a very small part. My father was an Arlington County policeman, and he was actually there the day they integrated because there were hundreds of policemen there in case something happened. I didn't even know this until I was teaching civil rights to my class. And I said, hey, Dad, did you know Arlington was it? He's like, yeah, I was there, Cathy. What? How have you not told me this? So I think it's, I wish he was still alive so I could ask him more questions, but this was really significant. And I wanted to make sure that we all continue to tell this story. So I think the first question that people might have is, why did this fight take place in Arlington? And there's a couple of reasons. Arlington had a huge population growth. From 1920 to 1930, the county population increased 40%. With that came planned communities, building of apartments. And then, of course, when the Pentagon came in, it brought a lot more people. So we had a population growth. And it was not just a population growth, but it was the kind of people that were coming. They were coming from all over the United States, a lot of them from the Northeast, and they were bringing in very different perspectives. We were potentially, even though like we were one of the few counties that voted against secession in the Civil War, there were more progressive people that moved into the Arlington area during this time. And that's going to make a difference in this particular fight. And then finally, and this is really important, the NAACP was looking for places to challenge desegregation, or to challenge segregation law, excuse me. And so they were looking for what's called chinks in the armor. So what they wanted to do is they wanted to find localities that had very small African-American populations so that there would not be a huge clamor and it would not bring as much attention when they were trying to integrate. At the time, Arlington's population of African Americans was 5%. So we, like Charlottesville, Front Royal, these were very small places. And that is where the NAACP was looking to launch these suits. And that is why Arlington was selected. Oops, go up. So tonight, we're going to really focus on two different women, Elizabeth Campbell and Dorothy Hamm. We're all talking about the same issue, but they had different objectives and they had different aims. They did not work together. They were each, excuse me, working in their own area on this issue, but not necessarily working together. Although at the end result was something that was achieved. But that is really clear that they each were fighting for their community in very different ways, as you're going to see in the presentation. I also, I love the quote when Abigail Adams says to her husband, "Remember the ladies." And I think it's important that we remember the men. It is Women's History Month, but I've had the opportunity to speak to Elizabeth Campbell's son, Don, and I have had many opportunities to talk with Carmela. And both of these children said, my fathers were very involved in this struggle too. Leslie Hamm, pictured here, worked for the federal government. So he was in the background a little bit because he had concern about his job. Edmund Campbell was much more involved, and he actually was the lawyer for the Norfolk case on desegregation. But I want to make sure that we recognize that even though we're celebrating women, there definitely were men equally involved in this fight. So I want to start with introducing you to the two ladies to give you backgrounds of them. So we're going to start with Elizabeth Campbell, and I'm not going to read everything, but just to give you a background that she is from North Carolina. Her father was a Moravian bishop. She wanted to go into the church, but at that time, the church was barred to women. They couldn't achieve those kind of leadership. So she got involved in education, which was one of the tenets of the Moravian religion, to focus on education. So as you can see, she was highly educated with a master's from Columbia Teachers College, Columbia University. And she served as a dean when she was a dean at Mary Baldwin, which is in Stanton or Staunton, however you want to pronounce it. She met Edmund Campbell. He was a widower. He had kids, and they married. And then she moved to Arlington and raised her children here. Some of the things that she was involved in the community, definitely actively in the community. She started the Roxbean Cooperative Nursery. She was a member of the school board. We'll talk about this twice because she gets kicked off. She took leadership roles, especially things related to education. She started the first special ed program. She was part of the leadership for that. Her probably most famous acclame is for starting the educational TV and WETA. In fact, tonight I thought it was very appropriate. My husband and I ate at the Carlisle, right on Campbell Avenue, right across from WETA. And that was very appropriate with Dorothy, tribute to Elizabeth Campbell. So let's talk about Dorothy Hamm. So Dorothy Hamm comes from Caroline County. It's about 90, maybe 70 to 90 miles from here. It's kind of out in the country. She grew up there in a 3-room house. She went to school in DC. Very, very common. Our schools in Arlington at the time were not accredited. And so there was the teachers were not didn't have as much like advanced degrees. The facilities were not as good. And so it was very, very normal for people to go over to DC, where we had very strong professors, much more adequate facilities. And so she was educated there. She went on to graduate from Milner Teacher College, which is connected with Howard University. And she also attended business school in George Washington. She married Edward, he goes by E. Leslie Hamm. They settled into the Halls Hill neighborhood, Highview Park. They could not get a mortgage. It was very difficult for African Americans to obtain a mortgage. So they had to go over a 5-year period to gather up the resources and stuff, and they built their own house. Her career included various clerical positions in the federal government. And, I talked to Carmela about this recently, and I said, this was a very highly educated person. And she said it was very difficult for women to get leadership positions in the government, much less an African-American woman. And so she was a seamstress, and then she did work for the federal government in clerical positions. She was also actively involved in the community. She was a civil rights go-getter activist. She served as an election officer. You can imagine that connection with civil rights and making sure adequate voting and fair voting. She was a delegate to the Democratic conventions. She did active protests, not just in schools, but other facilities. She helped with the Congress of Racial Equality. She marched on Washington with Martin Luther King, and she led the establishment of a Head Start program. So this was somebody that was on the forefront of fighting for civil rights. So here we go. This is a great picture. It's very important to know that in many cases, whites did partner with African Americans, and here's a perfect example. This is early in this, about shortly after, like about 1955, 56, and this is Geraldine Davis, and she has very nicely gone into Stratford Junior High with these students to see if she could register them for class. The principal at the time, Claude Ritzman, said, "No, I'm sorry, it's against the rules. You cannot go to school here." And so they turned around. The other two went to their schools that they were going to. E. Leslie Hamm returned home because his mother was refusing to sign the forms that would require him to be assigned to a specific school. But this is something that they were doing, going in and trying. There were other kids in the county doing the same thing that day, trying to get in, making a point. I'm going in, I'm trying to register, and I'm going to see if you're going to let me in. So I want to give you a little bit of a background about the fight. It didn't start with Hamm, and it didn't start with Campbell. But so basically, Arlington schools were segregated. There was the Jim Crow laws that required, it goes back to Plessy versus Ferguson. As long as they're separate, they have to be separate but equal. And I'm going to put equal in quotes. The Racial Integrity Act, it just really banned the integration of races. So that was really kind of the dominant rule in Arlington. The African Americans had a primary school, and we had Hoffman Boston that eventually became Hoffman Boston Junior Senior High, which, as I mentioned, it was not accredited. So it was a challenge. You were not sending your kids with the best teachers. They were passionate teachers. They were wonderful teachers, but they didn't have as much training. They were paid less. They had inadequate. They were getting a lot of times leftovers from other schools. So it was really not the best. So there were a couple early movements. Esther Cooper led one of them. It was the Campaign for Better Schools in 1941. She did not get very far. She did get some concessions on improving facilities, a little bit of a raise of teacher salary, but at no mention of let's let our African-American kids go to a white school. In 1946, it got ratcheted up because in 1946, District of Columbia said that no longer could kids from Arlington go to school there without paying tuition. So our students that were going over there, the African-American students like Dorothy Hamm that were going over there, now had to pay tuition, and that was just not really viable. I know that Dr. Taylor, who is a member of AHS and has spoken for us, he talks about, he would get up super early in the morning, he'd take a bus over to his cousin's house, and then he'd walk to school with his cousins so that he could be considered like living with them. And so it really, now we have a problem because now our kids can't go to these better schools. We're going to have to really do something here. And like I said, there was a lawsuit shortly after that, Constant Carter versus Arlington School Board. It was in 1950s. She tried to enter W&L, and she basically sued for the right to go to school at Washington Lee. The federal judge denied her claim, but it was reversed and repealed. However, they didn't say you can go to the school. They said the school system had to work to make things more equal. They could still be separate, but they had to be more equal. And so once again, you got a little improvement, but no mention of we're going to let African Americans go to a white school. Okay. So now we're going to get into basically how we finally were able to integrate schools. Desegregate, because there's a difference between desegregating and integrating. So it was a clash between federal and state, and it's a multi-layered. In doing this presentation tonight, I'm trying to cull it down and make it, because there was appeals and this judge and that judge, and federal laws. So I'm going to try to make it as culled down as possible to kind of show you the progression and really what Campbell was doing and what Hamm was doing. So at the federal, Brown versus the Board of Education is an opinion from the Supreme Court in 1954. It is basically overturns Plessy versus Ferguson, which was in 1896, and said that separate but equal was acceptable. The person that wrote the opinion in this said that separate but equal is inherently unequal. And so this was the outcry that said now schools need to desegregate. Within a month of that decision, the Governor Stanley, announced that Virginia will continue to segregate. We are not going to not have segregated school. That is the way it is. And I think that it's really important to bring up right now somebody that has also been one of our topics of our one of our monthly meetings, and that was Senator Byrd. Harry Byrd was a very powerful senator, particularly in the South Side of Virginia. He had a lot of power, and he was very instrumental in trying to call a challenge to this federal law. And he was really a huge part in this battle to keep schools segregated. One of the things that the government did at that time, Virginia, is they formed a Gray Commission, and the Gray Commission was going to be looking at this new law to see how they were going to respond to it. Campbell at that time was a member of the school board, and basically they decided that they would look very carefully at the school plan. It was a committee, and she was on it, but it also was made up of members of the NAACP. So it was a mixed group of people that were really studying how we were going to integrate in Arlington. And the way they were going to do it is that it was going to be a very limited immigration. We were going to the idea was to start slow. And so she was kind of chairing that committee, and they were coming up with a plan for integration. Hamm was in her community. She was working to advocate for improved educational facilities. This is when she's sending her child in to try to get him to register. She's, speaking out against the facilities and trying to advocate for their kids in their community. I put this up. It's a political cartoon I use with my students when I taught social studies. And to me, it really speaks to the struggle. It is a door that says school segregation, and you can see that they're trying to pass it, and it's inch by inch. And that is what we're talking about, because we're talking about a 1954 Supreme Court decision, and we don't have any African Americans going to a school that's segregated until 1959. So really an inch by inch struggle. So things go on. The federal government has another Supreme Court decision, and many people call it Brown 2. And basically it's looking around, and there's not a lot of progress. And so in this decision, the states are really directed to segregate with all deliberate speed. They need to have a plan in place, and they need to do it. So here we are in Virginia, and this is a cartoon showing that how Virginia feels about the federal government. You can see that Virginia feels that in this case, that Virginia has more power, and it really goes into the ideal of who has more power, state or federal, the whole, states' rights. So the Byrd machine in Virginia announces that we are going to have massive resistance. And basically, if a school tries to integrate, we're going to close the school. And that is basically, what they are planning to do. The Gray report comes out at this time, and it's issued, and basically it gives the state some backdoor ways to desegregate. It allows, it says it will not allow desegregation. It also states that school attendance is not mandatory, and that if people want to send their child to a private school, they can get tuition grants, and that they have the power to close schools if they try to integrate. So That's, the federal government's saying yes, Virginia is saying no. They perceive themselves as more powerful. Campbell is on a committee. She's taken that committee that she's worked with, and they're struggling because they're trying to balance. This is what the federal government is saying, and this is what my state is telling me. She actually testifies before the state, and she's trying to come up with, she as part of this committee are trying to come up with this balance on what they are going to do and how they are going to address this integration issue. Hamm at that time will partner with the NAACP, and they will actually challenge these particular segregation laws. So let me give you a little bit more information on that. So she is actively working. She's going to try to challenge it, and they are going to, it's going to be a fight because the state is just determined that they are going to not allow it. So one of the back doors that the state had was that they had, oh, actually, let me go back and talk a little bit about, let me see, hold on just a second. I want to give you a little bit more information before I go here. So basically, the state is going to eventually, when they hear that Arlington's trying to integrate, they're going to take away the school board. They're going to strip the school board, and they're going to pass laws stripping them of the right to have an elected school board. We were the only one in the state that did, and that's going to strip them from their power. As far as Hamm, I want to talk a little bit more about this lawsuit because this is important. The lawsuit is Clarissa Thompson versus the Arlington School Board. It includes E. Leslie Hamm as one of the plaintiffs. And interestingly enough, and this is an important note, Barbara Marks was a white lady, very active in the NAACP. She is part of that lawsuit because she also wants her children, her white children, to be in a school that is integrated. And so she's going to be a part of that particular lawsuit. So Judge Bryan, federal Judge Bryan, ruled in favor of the suit. However, he said that in order to do it, they had to follow the bureaucratic process that would allow kids to, by the laws, get into a school. That bureaucratic process was called the pupil placement form. They appealed this because that was a problem, which I'll explain in a second. And they appealed it, and it took 2.5 years for it to work its way through the court. So inch by inch. So let me talk about this pupil placement form. This is actually the official pupil placement form that Dorothy Hamm filled out for her son. You can see, hopefully, very right there, you can see that she says in protest. They couldn't hear you say that. Oh. Dorothy Hamm signed it in protest. So she was not going to do it, but because the judge says you have to follow the bureaucratic process, she submitted the form. This was a requirement. It was sent out to all students. They could apply for a placement in a school. African Americans could apply for a placement in a white school. So that is what she did. And I want to give you some statistics on the pupil placement form. So she completed this in 1958. It was under protest. And this was related to the Bryan ruling that they had to follow a bureaucratic process. At first, they had said that after the placement form, there'd be an interview with the student and no counsel could be there. And then they changed their mind and they said that parents could bring legal advisors to these meetings. So in 1958 and 58 in Arlington, the placement board rejected all 28 African American seeking to transfer to a white school. These are some of the reasons that they gave. Students did not live close to a white school. 11 of them were denied for that reason. White schools that they wanted to attend were overcrowded. 5 were denied for that reason. 22 were denied because they said they had inadequate academic achievement. 7 were denied because they said they had undefined psychological problems. And 5 were denied for undefined adaptability. In fact, someone said to Carmela's mother, to Dorothy, your child will not be loved at Stratford. So this was a back door. This was a way that they could keep students from going to the school. They were following the bureaucratic process, but they weren't getting anywhere with the bureaucratic process. I think it's really important to note that E. Leslie Hamm was an honor student with a genius IQ that lived very close to Stratford. He was denied entry into Stratford. And, we had the opportunity, we honored the Hamms a couple years ago at a banquet. We honored Dorothy for her contributions. And E. Leslie Hamm got up and told about his very, very successful career down in Virginia Beach and the scars that came from being told you're not adequate to go to the school. Interestingly enough, and I think that this is really important, up to 1959, 500,000 African-American kids had applied to attend white schools in Virginia, and none of them were deemed acceptable to attend those schools. So there we go, inch by inch, fighting through the court. What are we going to do? All right, moving along. The federal government it was a Supreme Court. Arlington is required to integrate. There's no choice now. Arlington is required to integrate. I've already told you that the state eliminated Arlington's elected school board. So the appointees were made by the county board, which was not totally, but a little bit more sympathetic to the state's policies. And the pupil placement form was what they were going to use. And you've seen how unsuccessful the pupil placement form was in getting African Americans to go to white schools. So Campbell is now, and all the school board members that were trying to get a limited plan for integration, they now are powerless. And so they do something different, a little bit more radical. Along with her husband, Elizabeth, it becomes part of a Save Our Schools committee fighting massive resistance. All right. So I think it's really important to note this was an all-white committee. They numbered at 1 point 700 members, but I want to read the tenets of this. This is a form thing that was sent out. You can see Elizabeth Campbell's name there. But number one, the members of the organized committee, we agree that number one, we are determined to pursue every legal means to keep public schools open. That was their number one goal. They want to keep the schools open. Number two, we are here concerned neither with perpetuating segregation in schools nor hastening integration. So they were agnostic on that issue. Number three, we oppose entrusting public education to private hands, having no responsibility or accountability to the general public. Number four, we have faith in Arlington's ability to meet its public education problems. Number five, we recognize the excellence of the teaching administration staff in Arlington schools. We assure them that the community values its educational system. It is determined to maintain public schools. We urge Arlington teachers to stand with the community in the days ahead. So they came out, like I said, 700 strong, and they used political pressure. A lot of very well-known people. You can see right here, President of the American Association of University Women, Northern Virginia Benai Burith, former member of the Arlington County Board, Arlington Catholic War Veterans, President of the Arlington Council of Church Women. So there were a lot of community activists in the county, or like community engaged people, and they were using their political pressure. Integration could happen, but their goal mainly was to keep the public schools open, which was also, once again, the state wanted to close schools that tried to integrate. Finally, the appeals are, they're done. Finally, it comes out that they have to start admitting African American students. The federal government says that school closings to prevent desegregation are a violation of the 14th Amendment. In Virginia, the Supreme Court says closing schools is a violation of the right to education. And the massive resistance policy is struck down by a very slim margin. There were still a lot of people that were still struggling with it. Campbell is continuing to work on the committee, continuing to put pressure on the county to keep schools open and to get kids. And then finally, basically, the pupil placement form is told that they have to start admitting African Americans, that they've exhausted their legal challenges and tried to keep it out. And so they identify 4 students that they think are acceptable to enter. And so on February 2nd, 1959, these 4 students, Lance Newman, Ronald Deskins, Michael Jones, and Gloria Thompson, enter into Stratford Junior High School, thereby effectively being the first 4 in the state of Virginia, as I said, by 10 minutes, but they were the first to go. And a lot of people call it the day that nothing happened, because we were very fortunate. Because you look at Little Rock, Arkansas, and places where it was violent, we were lucky. There were a lot of policemen there, my father being one of them, but it was relatively peaceful. That's not to say that there wasn't trauma in the school, and it was very difficult for the children. But as far as any major clash, that did not happen. And so we basically integrate Stratford, and it is the beginning. And then you will see Norfolk follows us by 10 minutes. And so they're the second to desegregate. Just as a footnote, on that particular day, Theta Henley, who had been actively involved, a white person that lived across from Stratford, it became HB Woodlawn, she actually held a tea in her house because, as you imagine, the parents were very nervous to know what was going to happen. And so Dorothy Hamm was there, and Elizabeth Campbell was there. And I know Carmela told me that her mother's big memory from that day was that Mary Marshall, another state delegate, served her tea, and that impressed her very much. But they were there to watch over the students on the day that Arlington integrated. Once again, desegregated, because once again, as you're going to see in this next slide, the desegregation of Arlington schools continues through 1971. So just because 4 students went in 1959, it's another decade for we can say that we have achieved the plan that that was put into place. And only in 1971 did they eliminate a race-based pupil placement form. So it became a little bit easier after that, because still they were going through this thing of evaluating to see if they would fit and adaptable. Campbell does return. We get the elected school board back, and Campbell does return to the school board. And in addition to her work on improving Arlington schools, she gets involved with educational TV, and then she launches WETA. Hamm's son finally gets to attend an integrated school, and she turns her attention to other areas of racial inequality. She was part of the lead of getting African Americans to be able to participate in athletics. So even when the African Americans came to school, when they had dances, they put a rope and they had to dance on separate sides. They were not allowed to participate on the same sport teams. So she continued to advocate for that and other areas. She was definitely out there. She got arrested in 1963 for trying to integrate theaters. So she continued her advocacy to make sure that her children had the same opportunities that other children had. Elizabeth Campbell has been very honored in our county. She did receive a state senate resolution. She has a school named after she and her husband, and I told you I was on Campbell Avenue this evening. She was a Washingtonian of the Year, and she is won an award for her work with WETA. Dorothy Hamm equally. You know, she has a Dorothy Hamm, and if you haven't gone there, they have a beautiful Civil Wakes display and walk to kind of see this story that I have been telling you tonight. She won a Martin Luther King Award, Outstanding Volunteer, Resolution Lifetime Achievement. She was a recipient of the African American Trailblazer Award, and of course, she has a middle school named after her for all of her good works. I thought it might be helpful for you as we come to the end of my story that I'm telling to actually hear from both of these women. So I have a short video clip. First, listening to Dorothy Hamm.
When the schools in Norfolk were closed, a group of citizens from Norfolk came to Ed's office in Washington to ask him if he would take the case and try to open the schools in Norfolk. And he called me one Thursday and said, "Elizabeth, I've been asked by a group of citizens from Norfolk if I would take the case and try to get the schools of Norfolk open. And what do you think?" And I said, "Ed, you've never asked me before what I thought about your taking a case. And why do you ask me now?" And he said, "Because, Elizabeth, if I take this case for the Norfolk citizens, I may never get another case in the state of Virginia." And I said, "Well, Ed, you do what you think is right." And so he took the case. So Arlington won. Now, it won because the people wanted it. And those of us on the school board who fought were just representing the people. And because we represented the people won.
Here's Dorothy. How's YouTube? Yeah.
Over 40 years ago, I was asked why I fought so hard for equal education and equality in other facilities. There are many reasons why I did this, but there is one reason in particular, and this is an attempt to answer the question of my 8-year-old son. Some of the comments coming from Bernard was very touching. He was quite outspoken and he wanted to know the answers. One particular one that he said was, "Why can't I?" That was involving his attending Stratford Junior High. It was difficult to have to explain, why you can't go because you're a colored child. And later on to try to explain why you still can't go. And of course, after all of my explanation to him, he said, "Mama, you told me that I could go to Stratford." And when you tell a child, or at least when I told one of my children that they could or could not do something, I meant it. And to him, because I had told him that he could go to Stratford, he couldn't understand why, even though at one point the judge had said, "You can't go." So that was a difficult thing for me to attempt to explain to him. He was denied admission to Stratford. But because we went back in court, he was able to attend. And of course, finally he did get an opportunity to go to Stratford, maybe 3 or 4 years later after he finished the 6th grade, I believe, 1 week after Stratford opened. After being denied to go to school for 6 or 7 days, finally Bernard started to Stratford Junior High. One day he returned to his seat and he found this block in his desk. And on this block is a picture of a man with a rope around his neck, hanging from a tree, with the words, "nigger." You can imagine how a 10-year-old child would feel to find something like this. Of course, he brought it home and he showed it to me, and the first time during the course of all of those years, I believe I really got upset, or perhaps I can even say angry, Because even though I had told him something like this may happen, frankly, I never thought it would. It's difficult for me to talk about a lot of other things that happened during that time. I still find my eyes filled with tears talking about it or even thinking about it. And I can still hear the words from Bernard saying, "Why can't I?" But in the end, it turned out to be, "Why can't we? Why can't we be equal? Or why can't we be considered equal along with everybody else?"
And so I end there. There's certainly a lot of great resources. A Chink in the Armor is a great article. If you go to the Arlington Historical Society, we have like the progress of African Americans. We have a slideshow. The library has some great information to see this. You can almost just Google desegregation in Arlington and find a lot of resources. But these are just think abouts. We don't have to share, but just what were the motivations? Clearly, the women had different aims and different objectives, but what are the motivations for women to fight for the community? And do we have a moral responsibility to fight for our community? And I thank you for listening, and I will take any questions. I'll put on my glasses so I can see you. Yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah, Geraldine Davis. Yes.
Hey, Kathy, can you repeat the question for the Zoom audience?
Yes. I'm waiting for a question, and I will.
In that image, yeah, that one. Probably,
A lot of these, so her question is, who was following these kids to take a picture of them when they were at this lunch counter or at this counter? Yes. A lot of it was documented. So we have a lot of images, and you'll see that a lot of the images are newspaper, things that were taken in the newspaper. And yes, I think that putting the story in front of people and having these pictures, there were times that reporters were used to certainly do that. Yes.
Was that just for Black students or white students taking that test to see if they
Yeah.
were able to?
Okay. So she was asking about the pupil placement form and whether it was for Blacks and whites. So the pupil placement form was a form that was used for admitting schools. It's just that they had a interview. It wasn't really a test that they took. They interviewed, and so they had to come for an interview. So it was used as a way of placing students in schools, and it was used for people that were transferring. So the Blacks were applying to transfer to another school. And so that is why you see this particular group. So it was definitely people, like if I was a white student and wanted to transfer, I would have to fill out that form also. But it wasn't an actual test they took. It was an interview. Yes.
Did you find similar forms for other ethnic minorities like Asian or Hispanic?
Predominantly, I've been focused. Go ahead. Oh, I'm sorry. Did you find forms for other ethnic minorities? The answer is like I've been predominantly looking at the African American population, and it was primarily used during this time as a backdoor way to keep schools from integrating. Certainly, Arlington, and I grew up in Arlington in the 50s and 60s, and it looked much different than what it might have looked at like today. And I do believe that they might have had similar issues, but it's a particular time that we're talking about in the 1960s. Predominantly, it was used as a backdoor to keep African Americans from attending white schools. Yes.
Were these students trying to register at a neighborhood school or?
That's a great question. So were they trying to register at a neighborhood school? So one of the things that you will find that a lot of the students that were trying to go to the school to register to transfer were students that lived in the Highview Park Halls area, because the Langston was way down in South Arlington. And so they literally had a school that was a mile from their house, and they were having to drive, or their parents were having to drive them all the way to the other side of the county. And so that is where you saw a lot of them, because they wanted to go to schools that were in their neighborhood. And so that's why you saw a lot of those transfers coming from that particular community, just because of the proximity of Stratford. Yes. All right. Any questions from the Zoom?
Yeah, we do, Kathy.
Okay.
Melinda asked, and maybe you can explain a little on this. What is the difference between integration and desegregation?
Yeah, that's a great question. So desegregation is when you're going to start moving students into a school. You desegregating, meaning you're allowing them in. Integration was when you really would have them melded in. So an integrated school would not still be separating kids in athletics. You would not still have a ropes where they had dances on different sides. You would not have a cafeteria where they sat in different locations. So an integrated school would be a step further, because it would mean that there was total acceptance of blacks and whites in this particular case working together. And that's why, and that actually came from Martin Luther King. He's the one that had the quote that desegregation is not integration. So we want there to be no difference, but desegregation is the step. It's the movement in that direction.
Okay, and this one is more of a comment, but you may want to elaborate on it. Are you aware of the video biography that Arlington's public access channel did of Elizabeth Campbell?
Yes, I believe you might be referring to It's Just Me, and it is available. No? Okay, because I know that I will tell you that the quote that I use from Elizabeth Campbell is from It's Just Me. And that was done by an Arlington employee, a school employee. And that is a great one that's, it's available on our website, it's available on our YouTube. But I have not seen, I've read a lot about Elizabeth Campbell. I've talked to her son, but I have not seen that video, no. Yes.
When did the two ladies pass? And are the original four, are they still alive?
That's a great question. I will, Elizabeth Campbell, I believe, died in, when did Campbell and Hamm pass away? I don't know if Carmela's on. She can probably tell me about her mother. Elizabeth Campbell was very old and passed in the early 2000s. And Dorothy Hamm, is Carmela on the thing?
Carmela is on, and Carmela, if you want to unmute, you could chime in.
Tell us when your mother
Yes.
passed.
Yes,
And what was your
thank you.
second question?
She's on.
My mother passed 2 days. She passed May 14th in 2004, which was 3 days before the anniversary of Brown v. Board.
And as far as these, the four, I think that Michael Jones is still alive. Gloria Thompson is still alive. I think the only one that has passed is Lance. Is that correct, Carmela?
No, Ronnie Deskins unfortunately passed away. If it wasn't last year, it was the year before.
Okay, yeah, right. So Michael Jones lives out in like Centerville, and I think Gloria lives in California. Is that accurate?
No, Lance was living in California.
Okay.
Gloria is in Maryland.
Yeah, we've had the opportunity. Michael Jones has come many times and has been very gracious about coming. When I was a supervisor, we had him in to meet with teachers and has been very gracious about spending time. Carmela has been outstanding about being here and making sure that her mother's story has been continued to be told, and has been at many events and really has been gracious to AHS too, sharing some of her mother's archival stuff. So some of these pictures and stuff are coming from the Hamm collection. Yep. Any other questions? Thank you, Carmela. Any questions for Carmela? Carmela was a baby when all this was going on, right, Carmela?
Yes, actually, my mother was pregnant with me when they were settling the court case, and the schools, Stratford, desegregated in February of 59. I was born in July of 59, a few months before the second group of students. A lot of people may not realize this, but for the 59-60 year at Stratford, they allowed 7 Black students in the first week of school and then 7 more the second week of school. And in June of 1960, my eldest brother, Edward Leslie Hamm Jr., and Barbara Harrison Baskerville were the first 2 and only African Americans to graduate that year. And they were told by the principal that they may as well not come to the senior dance, because if they did, they could only dance with each other. So the community threw a dance for all of the children. And if I'm not mistaken, I think at the lawyer's encouragement, the 2 students went to the dance, but only stayed briefly.
There's a difference between desegregation and integration. Yeah, that's a perfect example. Any other last questions? Yes.
When the students finally got into the classrooms, how smooth or rough was it?
So they're asking it when the students got in the classroom, how smooth or rough was it? It certainly was no Little Rock. Certainly, like I said, they call that day in Arlington the day that nothing happened, because it was, there was no yelling and screaming and stuff like that. But it's, there was some subtle racism. And as you saw from the example of the noose that came home, that there was some evidence of that. I think that, Carmela, you and I talked about this the other day. I think that we talked about that the students that experience this have been pretty gracious in telling that story. Would you agree?
Yes, I hear more stories of racism or unpleasant events that occurred from students that were at Washington Lee at that time. I'm not that sure about Stratford, because Lance, Ronnie, and Gloria are very mild-mannered, which is probably why, as well as Michael also, which is probably why those 4 were selected. But you really don't hear the 4 of them talk about anything that was really horrific that happened to them. But I do know that they were paired in 2s for their classes. So there wasn't like each one of them were taking separate classes, so that there were 4 different classes that students of color were attending. They were together, 2 in each class. So I believe Michael and Gloria were in the classes together, and then Ronnie and Lance were in classes together that first year, which really wasn't even an entire second semester of school, because they entered school February 2nd, as opposed to January when school started for the second semester of the 1958-1959 school year.
And I used to tell, when I taught this civil rights in my classroom, I explained to my students, you can't legislate attitudes. And Martin Luther King was quoted as saying, you can't legislate morality. So it takes a long time to change hearts and minds. And so, I think, like I said, we were lucky because we did not have what happened in other areas of the state and also of the nation. But, it was an inch by inch process. Any other questions?
Let me just interject this real quickly. It just popped into my mind that there was one young woman who was younger than these 4 students, who was voted most athletic girl at Stratford, and the young man who was voted most athletic boy refused to pose in the picture with her. So there were some subtle things that occurred, as well as the first day of school for those 4. There was a young woman who refused to go to school. She walked out and was interviewed by the press, and that made it all the way to the newspapers in Venezuela, which included a photograph of her being interviewed by a news reporter.
Any other questions? Thank you so much for coming this evening. Really appreciate it. You know, it's a story that I think is really important to tell. And so I appreciate you taking the time to be here tonight. Have a good evening. Thank you all of you on Zoom that hung with us throughout the
Okay.
presentation. Appreciate it.
And I'll end the Zoom session.
Thank you.